absolutely wonderful to me. And I just want to say that we cry out to the Lord the mess that our country is in, the mess that other countries are in, and the happenings and everything. We say, why, Lord, why, Lord? But this is absolutely a marvelous answer to what to do.
This being the insert inside the bulletin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Listen with care.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, so John Bunyan, how many people here have read anything from John Bunyan? Raise your hand.
I got started. We're going to Shelton. Gone down to Shelton for the days.
Okay. So when I first became a Christian, I was converted in Killeen, Texas, in I don't know, it was about 1975, and I was going to a small church that was a little bit academic oriented, and so some of the books I was reading was really, really heavy, and somebody, you know, they're always giving you books, and when you're first a Christian, you want to read everything, and somebody said, oh, have you read Pilgrim's Progress? And I said, no, you know, I'll put it on the list, you know, and I remember when I picked it up and started reading it, I was immediately hooked on this book. And I was immediately hooked on this book because the characters in the book had some of the same experiences that I had. And some of the people in the book were like some of the people that I had met in my young life. And so I read through that book, and it quickly became my favorite book, Pilgrim's Progress. In part because it's short, maybe, but in part because I could identify with several of the characters. And it changed over time because I first was interested in the first part of the book, the part where Christian, who's the main protagonist, was searching and how he found the Lord, or how the Lord found him. And then as years gone by, other parts of the book have become more interest to me. So anyway, so I've had this infatuation primarily with that book. Bunyan has written several books. He's written, I think the list that I saw was 58 different books. And some of his most famous ones are, like I said, Pilgrim's Progress. I'm going to be reading a little bit out of this one today. This is the modern English one. Grace Abounding is his autobiography, which is in the Old English. So you'll get a little bit of the Old English reading today and a little bit of the modern English today. And then I would just say for the grandparents in this room that this book I find to be really good for kids who are a little bit older. It's still a kid book, and it's primarily illustrations, but it has some of the text as well. It's abbreviated, but you know the pictures are a little bit gruesome and can scare a really small kid. There's a dog there, and then when he's when he fights the devil, I'll show you this picture here, since you're all adults. I can find it easily here. Let's see here. Anyway, whoever illustrated this really just did a fantastic job. But this book can still be purchased. You can get it at Amazon. Here's where he's walking through the valley where there's dead bones and they're trying to scare you to see all the skulls. And I can't find a picture where he fights. But it's a pretty gruesome picture. We can look at it afterwards. Yeah, we can look at it afterwards. Anyway, A Dangerous Journey. You can get that through Amazon. Okay, so I think to understand the writings of Bunyan and to understand Bunyan himself, you have to have a little bit of understanding of the times in which he lived, and particularly note what happened before he was born because it affects the time that he was born. And so I have a little timeline here that can help you kind of keep track of what was happening. But he was born in this small little town called Elstow. Elstow was about a mile south of a bigger city, Bedford, and Bedford was just a little bit north of London. Okay, so if you think about London and go a little bit north, he did most of his work in Bedford and Elstow, where he was born. And he was born in November of 1628, and it was the same year that Parliament makes a Petition of Rights. Now, I don't know if you remember your European history. I don't. But there was this conflict between the monarchy and Parliament back then. And the monarchy had most of the rule. In fact, the monarchy would call the Parliament together to meet primarily for the purpose of raising taxes and generating income. And then the monarch, whoever it was, would often disband the Parliament and then go off on his own or her own and do the kinds of things that he or she did, sometimes illegally, sometimes brutally. And so the people were more represented by the Parliament. And so when the Parliament was called together to raise money, oftentimes they would go before the king or queen, in this case, in this period of time, mostly the king, and they would say to the king, okay, we have some grievances against, the throne, because you're putting people in jail, it shouldn't be put in jail, and you're doing all these kinds of things. And so there was this tension that occurred between Parliament and the throne. And if you look on your timesheet, you can see that at the end of James I, the end of his rule in 1622 is when he finished and he dissolved the Parliament. And so when Charles I comes to the throne, then the remnants of Parliament makes a petition of rights because Charles says, hey, I need to raise some money. I want to call this new Parliament together, and they give him a petition of rights. And it's the same year that this occurs that Bunyan was born. And the petition of rights basically was, hey, these are our objections against the throne. So you can see that there's this tension building up between the Parliament and the throne. It's not unlike what we have going on even in our day, right? This tension between the executive branch and the Congress. So anyway, in 1642, a little bit of a civil war breaks out in England. And the civil war is between those who support the Parliament and those who support the throne. And Oliver Cromwell, who comes into power in a few years, he fights with the parliamentarians. And in 1645, the Parliament took control of the monarchy. And that's sort of the beginning of what happens in Bunyan's young life. Because when he's 15, when he turns 16 rather, he's drafted into the army and he fights alongside the parliamentarians. And it's kind of interesting because he belonged to a company that was supposed to go out and attack a particular position, and somebody approached him from a unit, from within his unit, and said, hey, can I take your place? And he said, okay. So the guy took his place, and they went out, and he was a sentinel on this particular mission, and he got shot. The guy who took his place got shot in the head with a musket ball and killed. And so that had an impression on Bunyan that somehow the hand of God was on him, although he himself was not a Christian at this time. And he did not really grow up in a religious family. His his father was a tinker. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just finish the back setting, the political back setting. So in 1653, Oliver Cromwell becomes the head of the protectorate. Now, the monarchy, before this happened, the king had established a state religion in England. And what would that be? Say it loud.
Anglican.
Yes, the Church of England, the Episcopal, the Anglican Church. And they had a pattern of worship that they followed, the Book of Common Prayer. And so the monarch, who sort of appointed the archbishop, who at this time was an archbishop by the name of Laud, Laud, and together they insisted that everybody follow that form of worship. And all of the nonconformist people, those would be the Baptists, the Puritans, the Presbyterians, everybody who was non-Anglican at the time, okay, they were persecuted if they didn't follow the Book of Common Prayer. And so when Cromwell took over, he got rid of that requirement and said, no, you can follow it or you don't have to follow it. And so there was a rise at that particular time of sort of Presbyterianism. The Westminster Confession was created then during this period of time. And so the nonconformists and the conformists sort of lived peacefully for a few years inside there. But before that, you couldn't have the freedom to worship the way you wanted to. And then shortly after that, you couldn't either. And the shortly after occurs under Charles II. And it was at this time that Bunyan was imprisoned because he was a nonconformist, okay? And he wasn't licensed by the Episcopal Church or the Church of England. And so they said, you have to stop preaching. And if you don't stop preaching, you're going to jail. He went to jail. He was in prison. He actually was in prison twice. So that was the political background. And that led to what eventually happened to Bunyan, which led to his prolific writings. Okay, because it was in jail, in prison, where he did most of his writings. Okay? All right, so let's just talk about him as a person a little bit, okay? First of all, he was born to a poor, ordinary couple. And so I wanted to read, if you'll allow me to, just a section of how he describes it in his autobiography. So he says, for my descent then, it was, as is well known by many, of a low and inconsiderable generation. My father's house being of that rank that is meanest and most despised of all the families in the land. And the meanest isn't like the kind of word that we understand mean to be. It was just an outsider, okay? They were not part of the they were not low base, if you will, right? Wherefore, I have not here as others to boast of noble blood, or of a highborn state according to the flesh. Though all things considered, I magnify the heavenly majesty, for that by this door he brought me into the world, to partake of the grace and life that is in Christ, by the gospel.
Don't you love that? By the door.
That's exactly right, by the door. And that understanding will come out in his books, particularly in Pilgrim's Progress. We're going to look at that a little bit later and do a reading from that talks about that very thing.
Well, us, me.
And us too, and that's why I like the book, and you too. Yes?
Who wrote the Book of Common Prayer?
I should know that. Who wrote that book? It was a group of individuals, but one was particularly Who's got a cell phone? Yeah, they couldn't do that back then. In fact, I want, just to show you what advantage we have today. When Bunyan was struggling with his soul before he was converted, he had remembered a verse and he couldn't find it. So what he did was, he said, he looked for it, he asked people of learned biblical knowledge and says, isn't there a verse in the Bible that says, because they didn't have the means that we have to find it. And they're like, I'm not sure about that. And he said, I'm sure I read that somewhere. And so he said, so finally he decided, okay, I'm just going to have to sit down and go from the beginning to the end until I find it. And he did. Read through the whole thing, couldn't find it. And well, it turns out that the thing that came to his mind was actually a verse out of the Apocrypha that he had read sometime before. But it illustrates this very issue, where we can just go to the internet and plug it in.
The Book of Common Prayer was the first compendium of worship in English. The words, many of them at least, were written by Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, between 1533 and 1556.
Okay, thank you.
Who, by the way, was burned at the stake upon a session at the throne of Catholic Queen Mary.
That's further in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We'll teach him.
Okay.
Oh, my.
Okay, so his dad was a tinker. A tinker that those days was like a metal worker, and he went around fixing things. And he went from town to town. He was a Mr. Fix-It guy, and it provided a low level of income, enough to sustain a family, but not enough really to get ahead. He received an ordinary education that a poor person would, which was basically to read and write, and that was about it. When he was 15, his mother died, and his sister died also the same year. They died within a month of each other, and then shortly after that is when he was drafted into the parliamentary army. So he's a young man, and apparently he's a gifted young man, but he's still not converted. And so, but not only was he not converted, but yeah, he was the leader of all the rascals. He was like the fraternity leader, who would lead people astray. So here's what he says about himself. He says, "It was my delight to be taken captive by the devil at his will. From a child, I had few equals, especially considering my years, which were tender, being few, both for cursing," so he had few equals for cursing, swearing, lying, and blaspheming the holy name of God. So he said, even though he was young, even though he's probably younger than the guys he led out, he was the one that had the strongest bent towards those things. "Yea, so settled and rooted was I in these things, that they became a second nature to me." So that's his account of those early days. Now, he grew up a couple more years and got married when he was around 20 to 21. I'm not sure exactly when. And the strange thing about it, he was married twice. His first wife, he was married for 10 years, and she dies. And so for 10 years, he's married to this woman, and we don't know her name. Isn't that interesting? We don't know her name. And he had 4 kids by this first wife, and they were Mary, Elizabeth, John, and Thomas. So 2 girls and 2 boys. The oldest, the firstborn daughter, was born blind. So 4 children. Now, it's very interesting because this first wife came into the marriage with only two material things. And they were two books that were left by her father who had died. And the first book was called The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven. And the second was The Practice of Piety. And so, let me read another section here, if I could, about Bunyan's opinion about these books. He says, presently after this, what he's talking about, he says, I changed my condition into a married state. That's not particularly a romantic comment, but I changed my condition into a married state. And my mercy was to light upon a wife whose father was counted godly. So he's not a Christian yet, but he sees that there's this quality in a woman who's raised in a godly home, particularly one who has a godly father. This woman and I, though we came together as poor might be, not having so much stuff as a dish or a spoon betwixt us, yet this she had for her part, the plain man's pathway to heaven and the practice of piety, which her father had left her when he died. In these two books I should sometimes read with her, wherein I also found some things that were somewhat pleasing to me. But all this while I met with no conviction. Another thing that he says in his autobiography is what an impression it made upon him the way that his wife talked about her father. She spoke very, very highly of him, and that influenced Bunyan quite a bit.
Are those books still available?
Which books?
That he quotes, that he read from?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. But
Plain Man's.
yeah, The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven and the Practice of Piety. Yeah. Okay, so now after Bunyan's married, there's this period that occurs during the first 5 years when he becomes converted. Now, his conversion, when he actually became converted, is a little bit difficult to tease out. In part because his conversion was a little bit, I'm thinking a little bit atypical, at least a little bit atypical from the way it happens in 20th and 21st century America. But maybe it was more typical back then, but he struggled through a whole lot of soul searching for many years, and we're going to read a few things to show you how that worked. But basically, he came under the influence, so he was married, came under the influence of this pastor who pastored a nonconformist church. His name was John Gifford, and John Gifford ministered to him. These books he read from his wife ministered to him. His wife's example ministered to him, and he was attracted to the sort of moral, upright behavior of various individuals, whether they were Christian or not. He came from a time when he was attracted to something else. Now he was attracted to the upright and moral, even though he wasn't yet quite a Christian. That attracted
Isn't
him to it.
that the way with our growth?
It is the way. It is the way with our growth. Yes, exactly. The Lord changes
Little by little.
our passion, and then some people quickly, but most people little by little, I think.
And who you meet.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So let's see here. So let me read you a couple things, see if you can get a little bit of a flavor of this, and then at the end of the class, we're going to we're going to have some readings out of Pilgrim's Progress, and you'll see how his character sort of reflects his own personal experience and how this influenced him. So, let's see here. Is this Old English okay? You can understand it, kind of?
Yeah, we went to see Shakespeare last night.
Okay, you're okay.
We're still in the mode.
Okay, so this is going to illustrate how during this period of time he has some enlightenment about the gospel, and even, I mean, he understands a whole lot about it actually, and he seems to be riding high, and then he doesn't have this assurance of salvation, and he starts riding low, and many times he wrestled with the idea of if he committed the unpardonable sin, and is there any way that God could forgive somebody like him? And so he rides this roller coaster up and down, and see if you get a little bit of flavor of that. So he says, this is when he's going up now. And there are no dates in this book, so it makes it kind of hard to pinpoint when everything happens. But that's the way it is. So he says, I began to give place to the word, which with power did over and over make this joyful sound within my soul. Thou art my love, and nothing shall separate thee from my love. And with that, Romans 8:39 came into my mind. Okay, so he talks about this joy that he had and this love for God that he had. And then he goes on to say that for about the space of a month after this experience, a very great storm came down upon me, which handled me 20 times worse than all I had met with before. It came stealing upon me, now by one piece, then by another. First, all my comfort was taken from me. Then darkness seized upon me, after which whole floods of blasphemies, both against God, Christ, and the Scriptures, were poured upon my spirit, to my great confusion and astonishment. These blasphemous thoughts were such as also stirred up questions in me against the very being of God and of his only beloved Son, as whether there were in truth a God or Christ or none or no, and whether the Holy Scriptures were not rather a fable and cunning story that rather than the holy and pure Word of God. And then I'll just do one more quickly here, if I can find the place. Page 75. And so he's going along again now. Some things he's gone up and down again. And so he gets to this other place. He goes, I found it hard work now to pray to God because despair was swallowing me up. I thought I was, as with the tempest, driven away from God. For always when I cried to God for mercy, this would come in. It is too late. I am lost. God hath let me fall. Not to my correction, but condemnation. My sin is unpardonable. So he struggles through this process for several years, actually. This isn't just a weekly thing for him. Let's see, but let's get to the good part, the decisive part, which occurs sometime later when he finally gets this assurance. He says, I'll read it to you. He says, but one day, as I was passing in the field, and that too with some dashes on my conscience, fearing lest yet all was not right, suddenly this sentence fell upon my soul. Thy righteousness is in heaven. And methought withal, I saw with the eyes of my soul Jesus Christ at God's right hand. There, I say, is my righteousness. So that whatever I was, or whatever I was doing, God could not say of me, he wants my righteousness, for that was just before him. I also saw, moreover, that it was not my good frame of heart that made my righteousness better, nor yet my bad frame that made my righteousness worse. For my righteousness was Jesus Christ himself, the same yesterday and today and forever. And then he says, now did my chains fall off my legs indeed. I was loosed from my afflictions and irons. My temptations had fled away, so that from that time those dreadful scriptures of God left off to trouble me now. Those dreadful scriptures were those that talked about whether, somebody commits the unpardonable sin, for example. And he said, those things that used to bother me now go away. Now went I also home rejoicing for the grace and the love of God.
He quit blaming God.
And he also, not only did he do that, but he also understood that it wasn't up to him to keep bolstering up righteousness. Right? He finally understood that, hey, go ahead.
He was convicted by the Holy Spirit. That's exactly what happened with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
That he accepted God but didn't understand about Jesus, and the Holy Spirit kept after him until he finally was convicted. It's over and over and over and over in every stories of people that are converted. It's not by their own intellect that they do it. It's not because they say, oh yeah, now I understand. It's because the Holy Spirit took the scales from their eyes.
And it's a little bit of the high Anglican church is this close to Catholicism. You're talking about mortal and venial sins. There's still that influence, I think, in the
Yeah.
post-Reformation. You still have that work
Yeah.
within the church.
So, I told you that one of the persons that influenced him was this Pastor Gifford. The other person that influenced him was Martin Luther. He did that through his commentary on the book of Galatians. And he says this about that particular book. He says, the God in whose hands are all our days and ways did cast into my hand one day a book of Martin Luther's. It was his comment on Galatians. It's commentary. It's probably more than a comment. I found my condition and his experience so largely and profoundly handled, as if his book had been written out of my heart. I do prefer this book of Martin Luther upon Galatians, except the Holy Bible, before all the books that ever I have seen, as most fit for a wounded conscience. And I don't know how many people were here when we studied the book of Galatians, but I mean, that was just a couple years ago, right? And that was, it really is a tremendous biblical book to speak of these very issues that he was wrestling with. Okay, so now he's converted, and so people in his church asked him. I think his pastor asked him to provide an exhortation for the congregation, and it was quickly discovered that he was a gifted preacher and he attracted lots and lots of people. And the problem was, though, is that Charles II now comes into existence, and now he is preaching, but he doesn't have a license. And so he's arrested and he's put in jail. And so apparently he had this amazing ability to touch the hearts of people. Okay? And you all know and have heard from preachers who preach but don't really get your heart. They don't really grab your heart, right? And then you've heard from those that really do, right? And some we all react differently to different people, but he was one that had this response from John Owens. Now, John Owens was a Puritan theologian who was probably the greatest academic of the day. Okay? And he was very instrumental in the Westminster Confession. And he just was the giant. He was the intellectual giant of the day. And one day King Charles approaches John Owens and he says, why, you being a great scholar, why would you want to go hear this uneducated tinker preach? So, that's quite a tribute that he would go and listen to him. And here's what Owen said. He said, I would willingly exchange my learning for the tinker's power of touching men's hearts. Yeah. So, anyway, he was a good preacher. Okay. Let's talk a little bit for just a second about his second wife. I found this very interesting. And her name was Elizabeth. So what happens is that after his first wife dies, a year later, he marries this gal by the name of Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth was younger than he was. And Bunyan was 30. I'm not sure how old she was, but she was younger. And it was right after, within a year after he married her, is when he got put into prison. And she was a feisty gal, and so she not only stepped up to take care of the 4 stepchildren, one of them blind. She did that. And but she also was pregnant when Bunyan got put into prison. And so she goes to the authorities to make an appeal to get him back. And she's not successful, but listen to this dialogue, okay? She goes before this tribunal, and the tribunal finds out, okay, why she's here, because of her husband. And one of them says, well, would he stop preaching? Because all he had to do was promise that he would stop preaching, and they'd let him out. Would he stop preaching? And she says, my Lord, he dares not leave off preaching as long as he can speak. Well then, what is the need of talking? And she says, there is need for this, my Lord. For I have 4 small children and cannot help themselves, of which one is blind. And we have nothing to live upon but the charity of good people. And then one of the judges, his name is Matthew Hale, says with pity, or asks with pity, if she really has 4 children being so young. And she says, my Lord, I am but mother-in-law to them, having not been married to him yet full 2 years. Indeed, I was with child when my husband was first apprehended. But being young and unaccustomed to such things, I, being smayed at the news, fell into labor, and so continued for 8 days, and then was delivered, but my child died. So she had a miscarriage. And so the Judge Hale was moved, but the other judges were hardened, it says, and spoke against him. He's a mere tinker. And she says, yes, and because he's a tinker and a poor man, therefore he is despised and cannot have justice. And one of the judges, Mr. Chester, his name, is enraged and says that Bunyan will preach and do as he wishes. And she says, he preaches nothing but the word of God. And another judge, a different judge says, he's angry now, this other judge says, he runneth up and down and doeth harm. And she goes, no, my Lord, it is not so. God hath owned him and done much good by him. And then the same angry judge says, his doctrine is the doctrine of the devil. And she says, my Lord, when the righteous judge shall appear, it will be known that his doctrine is not the doctrine of the devil. So that gives you a flavor of his second wife. Well-spoken individual who, it's...
But they still didn't release him.
No, they didn't release him, no.
Did you have to be ordained to preach?
Pardon me?
You have to be ordained?
Yeah, you had to be licensed and ordained by the Church of England.
Okay.
By the Church of England, okay? And again, there was this period of time just before he was converted where you didn't have to be. And then once he was converted, Charles II came in and reestablished that you had to be. So if you look at your outline, you can see sort of the under James I and Charles I, particularly Charles I, down to Cromwell's protectorate, during that top time, then you had to be licensed. And then under Oliver Cromwell, you didn't have to be licensed. And then when Cromwell died and Charles II took over, he reestablished that you did have to be licensed. And that's when Bunyan was converted. And so
During that time.
during that time, and, yeah. So it's in prison that he wrote most of his books. I think this one individual, Christopher Hill, he has an index of Bunyan's writings. He lists 58 books. I haven't seen all those titles. In 1972, he was released from prison. The political atmosphere was loosened up. Did I say 19?
Yeah. Just, wait a minute.
An old guy.
Just the other day.
Yeah, just the other day. Yeah. Actually, I had written 19 on a couple of these. I can go back and change it. So, yeah, in 1672. So, he was reprisoned shortly in 1675 to 76, and it was this time that most people think he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. So until the time that he died, which was in 1688, between the time he was released from prison and the time that he died, it still was a little bit precarious, and separatists had to meet sort of in hidden locations at different times. Sometimes they met at midnight. We had a conversation last week about people wanting to move our church service this way or that way. They're not happy with 30 minutes this way or that way. It's like, in those days, you would meet at midnight in the middle of the week so you could get together with other people, and then you change the time and meet at a different time, at a different place. And yeah, we're a spoiled group of people, that's for sure. Spoiled group of people. So he dies, he goes home at age 60, he fell sick. He rode a horse to another village primarily to help two men reconcile. They were having a problem with each other. And so he rode a horse there and he preached at the little village church, and then he rode back and they said the weather was bad. He caught pneumonia and he ended up dying. It's a respiratory illness.
So he didn't die in prison?
No, he was out of prison. He was released from prison.
Oh, I see, 6 months.
Yeah,
Okay.
in 1677, he was just there for 6 to 7 months. Okay. Okay, so now allow me to read from this edition here, The Pilgrim's Progress. This is a modern version, so the language is a little bit easier for those of us not accustomed to it. This book was actually given to me by some guy by the name of Frank Ecker in 1995. Yeah, heard of him? Yeah. So let's see if we can pick up on the main character. See if it's a reflection of what happened to Bunyan himself. Okay. So let me just see what I got here. Okay, good. So he says, as he begins the book, he says, "As I walked through the wilderness of the world, I came to a place where there was a den. There I lay down to sleep, and as I slept, I dreamed a dream. In my dream, I saw a man clothed with rags, standing by a path with a book in his hand, and a great burden upon his back. His face was turned from his own house, which stood nearby. I saw him open his book and read, then begin to weep. No longer being able to control his feelings, he broke out with a mournful cry. saying, "What shall I do?" In his condition, he went into his house. Drying his tears, he restrained himself as best he could, so that his wife and children might not know of his distress. But he could not be silent long, for his trouble increased. At length he began to tell his wife and children, "Oh, my dear wife and children, I, your father and companion, am undone by reason of an awful burden that lies heavily upon my heart. I am surely warned that this our city shall be burned with fire from heaven, in which terrible destruction all of us shall surely perish unless some way can be found whereby we may be delivered." Now, you know that his family thinks he's crazy, and they try to talk him down from this ledge, but he can't be talked down, and he runs around saying, "What shall I do to be saved?" Well, in that process, he runs into an individual called Mr. Evangelist. And this is what we read about Mr. Evangelist. He says, "Then I saw a man approach him and heard him say, 'My name is Evangelist. May I ask you why you are so disturbed?' And he answered, 'Sir, I understand from this book I hold in my hand that I am condemned to die. And after that to come to judgment. And I am not willing to do the first, nor able to do the second.' And Mr. Evangelism talks to him. I won't read you all of it. But he basically said, 'Where must I go?' And so pointing with his finger over a very wide field, Evangelist said, 'Do you see that little gate over there on the far side of the hill?' He said, 'No, I don't see it.' He says, 'Then do you see that tiny shining light?' He says, 'I think I do. Keep your eye on that light and you will go straight to the little gate, at which when you knock you will be told what you must do.' So he leaves, and he runs into some characters we're not going to talk about today. And he runs into some trouble, which we're not going to talk about today. But one person he meets is that we will talk about today, is Mr. Worldly Wise Man. And Mr. Worldly Wise Man tells him that, "Hey, this path you're on it's a troublesome, difficult path. And you can actually achieve the same relief of this burden that's on your back by going over to this town called Morality." And so that sounded pretty good to Christian, and so he actually goes. And he finds out that it's a dead end, and it looks like, there's this big overhang over this cliff kind of overhangs the path, and so he realized he made a mistake, and Mr. Evangelist runs into him and says, "Hey, what are you doing here? This isn't the way I told you to go." And so he said, "Is it too late for me? Is it too late?" He said, "No, it's not too late." That's some of Bunyan's experience. Is it too late? So he says, "No, it's not too late. Get back on the path and go where I told you to go." So by the way, that town of Morality happens to be on the hill called Sinai. Sinai. So what do we know about Mount Sinai? That's the law, right?
Right.
That's the law. That's the wrong way to go. That's the wrong way to go. Okay, so he heads back out, and so I'll read you this. I'll pick up now. So it says, "Then Christian determined to go back to the good way. And Evangelist, smiling, gave him his hand and said, 'May God bless you.' So he went back in haste, refusing to talk to anyone by the way. He walked like someone treading on forbidden ground, for he did not feel at all safe until he was again in the way Evangelist had instructed him to go. Back in the way, he finally came to the little gate. Over the gate was written in bold letters, 'Knock, and it shall be open unto you.' He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, and no one came. And he shouted, May I now enter here? Will you please open to me? Though I have been an undeserving rebel, if I am forgiven and allowed to enter, I will never cease to sing God's praise. At last someone came to the gate whose name was Goodwill. He asked in a deep voice, "Who's there? Where did you come from? And what do you want?" And Christian explains who he is and what he wants. And he opens the gate. And just as Christian was stepping in, Goodwill took him by the arm and gave him a quick pull in. And Christian says, "What does that mean? Why did you do that?" And he said, "There on the outside, not far from this gate, is a strong castle guarded by Beelzebub and his men, and from it they shoot arrows at those entering, that they might maim them or prevent them from entering." So, he enters the wicket. It's called the wicket gate, the small gate, the narrow gate, the door. Okay? There's only one way to enter, and it's through there. And that's why it's guarded by the evil one, because he knows that's the only place. And so he enters into that gate. Now remember, Bunyan, he enters the gate in his own life, but he had this up and down period. He's up and down period, right? He had this inability to get rid of this burden, and so it is with him. And so Christian said, "Hey, can I get this burden removed off here now that I'm in this gate?" And Mr. Goodwill says, "No, not yet. You have to carry it a little bit longer." And so he does. He carries a little bit longer, and I'll just get you to the point where he gets rid of it. So he says, "Now, I saw in my dream Christian walking briskly up a highway, fenced on both sides with a high wall. He began to run, though he could not run fast because of the load on his back. On top of the hill he came to a cross, and just as he got to the cross, his burden came loose, dropped from his shoulders, and went tumbling down the hill. It fell into an open grave, and I saw it no more." So here's a picture of this illustrator who has the thing falling off his back and falling into a grave that he sees no more. So that was Bunyan's experience. It happens to be Christian's experience as well. So next week I'm going to introduce you to, or reintroduce you to a few characters. I want to talk about the Doubting Castle that he goes into, and I want to introduce you to Faithful and to Hopeful. And
I did not know that that's where Goodwill got their name from.
What, no, the Goodwill?
Yeah.
It describes exactly what they do.
you mean the,
The organization.
Yeah,
the
interesting.
Goodwill. It just describes exactly.
yeah.
They hope that they
Yeah.
Why was it so hard to get preacher's license?
Because you had to be ordained as an Episcopal. Yeah. So if he would have, he had to be ordained, and that wasn't his theological bent. He was a Baptist, and they were considered non-conformists. They didn't conform to the Episcopal Church. And the Puritans were also considered non-conformists, because they were not Episcopal, Presbyterians.
And Quakers.
And Quaker, there were a lot of
George Fox was running around about that time too.
Say again?
Said George Fox was running around.
Yes, yes, in fact, do I have him in here, or did I take him out? I had him in here at one time.
On the timeline?
Yeah, but I might have taken him out. Yeah, that's right, same time. That's correct. Father, thank you for the example of your servant, Bunyan, and for this allegory that reveals the journey that we all take to one degree or another. Father, on this journey from the city of destruction from which we came to the great celestial city to where we are going. Thank you. In Christ's name. see, I just need a little bit of help putting back the.
Resume the normal.
King of the Bunyan.
Not the similarities, but they got.
Whatever you can see.
Hello.
When I went through. You didn't have to break any rules.
Right, whatever.
That's the same.
Good?
Yeah.
Very good.
Good. See how we fare.
Hi.
Take your glasses.
At a thrift shop in Connecticut.
Trying to turn it off. Here. Power.
They were my size.